Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining us. Welcome to Ad Age's Town Hall, addressing the experiences of Asians, Asian Americans, and Pacific Islanders in the ad industry. I'm Ishan Sherwood, Associate Creativity Editor here at Ad Age, and I'll be one of your moderators today. And I'm joined by co-moderator Anne Christine Diaz, Creativity Editor.
Hey, everyone. It's great to see so many of you out there. If you know of people who can't join us on the live stream, the video of the Town Hall will be available right here for free on adage.com.
So the coronavirus pandemic has been raging globally for nearly a year, and as cases rise, so do racist attacks against people of Asian descent, unfairly blamed for the disease by bad actors and politicians alike. White nationalism is now out in the open, so this is just the beginning. At the same time, a necessary conversation about Black lives is happening, so the AAPI community is figuring out how to balance being vocal about our own rights with being a good ally and supporting and making space for Black voices.
I'd also like to note that while we face many hurdles, there's also plenty of hope. For the first time ever, we have a woman vice president who is also Black and Asian American. So yay. Anyway, this is the third in Ad Age's regular series of town halls in which by leaders in sorry. Okay. This is the third in Ad Age's regular series of town halls in which we have been addressing diversity and inclusion in the ad world on a broad scale. Over the next hour and a half, we will be joined by leaders in space to answer your questions about inclusive marketing, barriers to representation, and connecting with the community. We received more than 120 questions and comments from you, and we'll try to get to as many of them as we can. But also feel free to post comments or additional questions on our social channels during the broadcast.
So with that, let's get to your questions. Before we start talking about how to fix problems, it's important to understand where we are. How is COVID fueling discrimination? And what does anti-Asian discrimination actually look like today? So please welcome Jay Kim, President of the Asian American Advertising Federation, Mariko Carpenter, VP of Strategic Community Alliances at Nielsen, and Nick Tran, Head of Global Marketing at TikTok. Everyone.
Hey, y'all.
Morning. Thanks for joining us.
Morning.
Thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having us.
All right, so first question. During the peak of COVID-led anti-Asian racism, the Asian American community sadly did not receive much public support from corporate brands. What do you think prevented brands from taking action, and how can agencies better educate corporate brands in supporting the Asian community? Maybe Jay, can you start us off here?
Sure. I think during this pandemic, a lot of big brands and corporates, I think they had a lot of different things on their plate, and one of them is multicultural and issues. And I think as Asian American pandemic-related racism was increasing, I think what we have experienced is, at 3AF is not many have come up to step forward. And I think they have really missed a great chance because this pandemic isn't just in the US, but it also happens in UK, Australia, New Zealand, and other different countries. So I think big brands could be like P&G and Unilever could have really embraced, could have been a champion. And that could have been much great engagement along 3 billion Asians, not just Asian Americans. So I think they missed out on that. And I think another reason is that, it's such a new and they didn't want to take the step right away. And I think that's why I always applaud brands like Nike, who really took up the whole Black Lives Matter, equal rights. And I think those are the, hopefully in the future with what's happening. And as Christine mentioned, that we have first Asian American vice president, and perhaps there's a way for them to step in and start to focus on what's really impacting Asian Americans during this pandemic with racism.
Yeah, I think Jay brought up a couple good points and a couple that I wanted just to reiterate. One, there tends to be this model minority myth, which I think it's a little bit difficult and challenging for Asians because the expectations are that Asians do it on their own, they're capable. There's a lot of positive stigmas that are associated with the Asian American community. And that might have created some reluctance for people to jump in. At the same time, we did have a situation with Black Lives Matter that actually needed more attention. And in that situation, I think a lot of brands like the Nikes of the world and others, they did take a stance and step in appropriately. And in that case, I don't think we should be concerned about not having more love or less love. I think we all know that as a collective society, it's important to highlight all the different groups that are in need. And at that moment in June, with the Black Lives Matter protests, that was where the attention was needed. But in general, I do think we need to break this myth of all Asians being, exceptional and great and like, the model citizen, and showcase the true range of what Asian Americans offer to the world at large.
If I can add to, go ahead, Mariko.
No, go ahead, Jay.
If I can quickly add to that, but Ad Council did create a campaign on fight the virus, fight the bias, and that was a historical, because for first time there has been a public PSA in regards to racism against Asian American. So I think even though the brands did not step in, Ad Council did step in with a lot of support, and 3AF has supported, along with other agencies who also created their own initiatives.
Yeah, I totally agree. And I think what we've learned from this pandemic more than anything from a corporate standpoint is that the consumers, right, the American public want to see corporation take a stand on social justice and actually do something and engage and act. So, I will say that the anti-racism that we were facing as a community started in January. There was actually a campaign here in New York City in February. This is even before the pandemic was even announced, because people were avoiding Chinatown, right? Because there was this misconception that if you ate in Chinatown, you can get the virus. So I'm hoping that, coming out of this pandemic, corporations will now really understand their need and their role in social justice, and it is their customers, their consumers, who actually are expecting corporations now to act and to engage.
Well, thanks for contextualizing that, Mariko. Yeah, remembering back to way earlier last year, that's what was happening. That's kind of how it started. So that's interesting that you brought that up. But before we move on to our next question, we have some shout outs. So Nisi, Tina, Shelly, Amelia, Junior, Kayla, Ramazan, and Alex. Hey guys, thanks for watching. And anyone who gives us a shout out, also tell us where you're watching from. So with the next question, Nick, you brought up the model minority myth. So I feel like this question is a little bit related. So Norman from the Bay Area asks, Asian Americans are perceived as competent but unfriendly, competitive, and foreign by many Americans. How can these perceptions be changed via the
I think you cut out, but I got the question. I think highlighting, again, the true range of what Asian Americans are and what we bring to the table, I think is important. I think there's a lot of misinformation out there. One of the examples that I give is the assumption that like Michael Jordan's son can play basketball as well as Michael Jordan. It's obviously not realistic. And I think it's interesting that for Asian Americans, we've been embraced by the community because we do act appropriately. We avoid confrontation, and oftentimes I think those things that are seen as positive sort of paint us in this little picture and put us in this little pigeonholed box. So I definitely think the more that we're able to be recognized for who we are as individuals and not as a generalized group of ethnic individuals overall, that to me would be like the first step. Obviously, there's a lot of misinformation out there. So one of the things that platforms and the media can do is continue to push against these stereotypes and allow people to just be who they are as people.
I couldn't agree more, Nick. I think that the media, all of us in the media industry, we have, to some degree, the responsibility to be able to use the platform and use media to break some of these stereotypes and be more inclusive. And so, if you think about the history of media, Asians were at one point very, very, very recent, were perceived as, either the weirdo nerd or the awkward nerd or a martial artist, right? And we all know, as our community, there's a lot of dimension and diversity within our community. And so I think, it is on us, right? All content creators, whether you're advertisers or programming creators, to be able to show all the different layers of Asian American, all the different diversity. I know at Nielsen, we actually responded to this greater need for inclusion in media. And we just published our first inclusion analytics diversity report. And that really speaks to not just the diversity of audience of some of these programming, but really looking at the talent, right? And who is being shown on screen, and who's the audience that it draws. Because I will tell you that advertisers are looking for programming that are inclusive, right? And the reason for that is because consumers are looking for programming that's inclusive. They want to see friend groups that represent their own friend group. They're looking for, a hospital that is very immigrant heavy, right? Reflected in media. So I think, as advertisers are creating their creative, I think the story and how we are represented in those storylines have to be reflective of who we are, as a community, as a whole, and show all the dimension. Now we're seeing a lot of LGBTQ Asian characters, right?
Yeah.
Wonderful. We're also seeing Asians in roles that we haven't seen in the past. So I think we're getting there, but it's really actually a reaction of what consumers are asking for.
Yeah, a key point is it's not just in front of the camera. I think it's just important to have a presentation behind the camera and writing the script and directing and producing. So I do think there's an opportunity for Asian Americans and Asians overall to think about what role can you play to drive the creative to be more representative of the community at large. And I think that's where, I know I don't like to be in front of the camera. So if my role is to be, behind and trying to guide the creative and work with different creatives and ensure that group and that team is diverse and representative of the Asian American community as well as other communities, then we have a much more likelihood that the stuff that you see in front of camera is true to the reality that we have.
So, also, I think, as I agree with Nick, it's not just the behind the camera, it's also in corporations as well. A good example is, just to remind everybody, last year, Parasite won, Oscars, right? And that shows a lot about the power of Asian American. And to kind of go along with that, what Mariko was mentioning, I think also, a lot of big corporations and brands and media, they can look at the stats. And along with kind of what Mariko and the available, 3AF also has our own media consumption study that showcases various media that Asian American consume. And I say that back behind a corporation because a lot of the judges, a lot of those panels, sometimes they're missing the insights. They may be multicultural, but if they don't have any Asian American representative, they are going to not know the insights. For a good example is a lot of Asian American, like my daughter and some of you who have gone through, we have what's called Saturday language school, right? And that's where you go and you learn Chinese, Korean, Japanese, and any kind of those language. But if you don't have that, then you won't understand the insights that go behind it. So I think a lot of the education, a lot of learning. So I would highly recommend, all media channels, all to have what I would like to call Asian 101, African American 101, Hispanic 101, LGBTQ 101, so that you understand the insights, and that will bring you to forefront. When you see those kind of content, you may not understand because you weren't educated, but after going through those education where you have data, you have insights, and you have understanding culture, then you have a better understanding why it's relevant and will be engaging to Asian American audience and broader.
Yeah, these are all really good points, because if you don't have the right people on your teams, then even if your intentions are good, you end up in this white savior scenario, and that's an uncomfortable place for everyone to be. Okay, so next question. Edwina from New York asks, where does one even start to arm themselves with the information needed to begin to work on bringing Asian and AAPI voices to life across media and creative? Mariko, can you tackle this one?
Yeah, sure. So coming from Nielsen, for me, it's, to me, it's always about data, right? Without the data, you're just another person with an opinion. There are some really good resources. If you go on Nielsen, and there's a lot of stats that are free. You don't have to be subscribers to our products to really understand the Asian community. We do an annual report that really talks about and it really goes to what Jay was saying about understanding our communities, right, in a deeper way, so that they could be authentic. So I think, going there, I do think, 3AF has one that's for disaggregated data. So if there are certain ethnic groups that you really want to target, but I think it's also, it also goes back to each of us. I don't want to forget that each of us has a big influential role that we can play. So when we do see programming that does support Asians, like, we have to use our own voice to support it, right? We are actually more social media active than any other ethnic groups, 21% more to be exact. We have people, if you think about Yelp, right? We're very passionate about giving our opinions and our reviews. And so Yelp is, I think, 3 times more higher for Asians than it is for other ethnicities. So I think it's important for us to use that same passion to actually support and show our voice for the brands who are supporting our community, for content that is actually helping to better represent us. And I see this happening a lot more in these influencers, right, who are Asian. They are speaking out, and the reason why that's so influential and important is because the audience that we have, we're not just speaking to Asians, right? We are speaking to, if you think about Eva Chan, her whatever million audience are not just Asians, it's everybody else, and that's how the education happens, is if we can go outside of our own community and really have those dialogues. So, whether it's a repost, I think every time we see something that is supportive of our community, I think if we all do that, we will see the power in our collective voice.
If I can kind of add to what Mariko was saying, first of all, I'm really thankful for Mariko and Nielsen, as they've been, doing what they can for AAPI community and always supporting 3AF and Asian with a lot of data. But as we all know, I just want to let everyone know that we don't have enough data, because it's complicated. You have 5 different key segments that are all different, have 3 of them speak different languages. So a lot of times, Asian American data gets left out because of its complication. And that's where I would ask, all the key stakeholders to invest, getting more data, because a lot of times if you don't have the data to back up, and what we live in the community, so we have to leverage insights. And a lot of times when we try to give our insights, because there's lack of data, they ask for data, and that's where it gets stuck. And unfortunately, there needs to be funding, more data, information. So again, I really appreciate Mariko and Nielsen championing that, but we need more of it. So I think that is how we can arm ourselves bring more engagement and inclusivity with Asian Americans.
Nick, do you have anything to add to that before we move on to the next question?
Yeah, just a quick point. I totally agree with the data side. One other thing is we as like a community can't just wait for people to reach out. I think there's an opportunity for us to be proactive and reach out to other people in the community and share our stories and just have that dialogue. I think oftentimes when I was growing up, we didn't really have too much familiarity with like the neighbors and all this other stuff, because my parents were a little bit more strict with my upbringing. And in general, I do think there's an opportunity for the Asian American community to do more outreach and create more allies out in the world.
Speaking of allyship, that takes us to our next question. So somebody submitted this question. The idea of allyship was talked about a lot in 2020. While it's important to give voice to the API experience, it's also important not to have the voice only reverberate in an echo chamber. What are some ways or examples of efforts you're working on to ensure that the AAPI messaging is being heard across communities and into the mainstream? So Jay, can you take this one?
Absolutely. Thank you. I think, when in 2020, when we're dealing with our own, pandemic racism and, issues, one of the things we had to do is make sure that we also support, Black Lives Matter, because, African-American communities has been, fighting for civil rights, and we are definitely benefiting from that. So as we feel that as they have eradicate racism and they fight for that, equal rights in their communities and systematic injustice and police brutality, I think, Asian American will only benefit from that big fight. And we will also have to deal with our own. But I think what's important is, at 3AF, we bridge gap and make bridge with other associations like ANA and multiple different organizations, whether it be justice and civil rights, so that we all can work together. Because end of the day, our goal is to have a proper representation, empowerment, and awareness of Asian American consumers. And we wanted to make sure that information gets out there to various different organizations, like AIM, ANA, and all different organizations that's cultural council, marketing council, and whatnot, so that, Asian Americans are always included in that diversity and inclusion, because a lot of times Asian American gets left out because it's the most complicated. Once you come in, at least, African American is English, Hispanic, there's a Spanish commonality, but Asian American, you have 5 different languages, 5 different cultures. So it always gets left out. So that we just want to make sure they understand and give them as much information, and so that it's easier for them to come into our communities, understand. And once you have that educational level, then there's understanding and there's a reason, and then for them to look into and start doing testing. And then the business and numbers show, because by 2023, Asian American spending power is going to reach $1.3 trillion. And that's a significant amount. If I can put that in a GDP equivalent to a country, Asian American and US will be equivalent to number 15 in the world as a GDP. So I think we are creating as much as we can, but we can always do better.
So next question, maybe we'll start with Nick on this one. They ask, I work in the tech industry where there is a large number of AAPI workers. How can we give a voice to AAPI tech workers, even though there are so many of us? I think basically they're getting at, like, the numbers are high, but it's not like there isn't as much of a voice as you would expect with those numbers.
Yeah, I think it starts with, not only just high numbers, but also, what are the numbers at the leadership levels? What's the board look like overall? And is there representation at the highest levels? Just taking that at a macro perspective, looking at the last, 10 years, let's say, of even like the legislative bodies in the U.S., there isn't very much Asian representation. And part of it is because, when we were growing up, or at least when I was growing up, that wasn't even a viable option, like, to go into politics. It was sort of like shunned because of the perception of that. And it was always the same, business executive, doctor, lawyer, things along those lines, engineer. And I think broadening the scope of what Asians can do to impact society and taking sort of the opportunity to step into the highest levels of office in government and politics would actually create a bigger ripple effect to, businesses, corporations, individuals, like across the board. So it definitely starts with representation at the top.
I can agree with you more, Nick. And I will also say that if you are part of a large organization, there is the ERG group, right? If you don't have one, form one. And then ask yourself, is your ERG group just as powerful as the African American group and as the Latino group, right? I think AAPIs have a tendencies to harder to galvanize, potentially because of our diversity within us. But I think it's necessary, and we need to have a collective voice, go to upper management, and ask the right questions, and make sure that that all the workers and their needs are represented, whether it's professional development or promotion to upper management, but really take that collective voice and take action.
I think it's a great point. And remember, 3 ERGs working together on a common goal is probably going to be more effective than each ERG
That's
working
right.
independently.
Right.
True.
All right. So thank you to Jay, Monaco, and Nick so much for answering those questions. It was really great to have you.
Yes, I feel like we
Thank you
just
for
got
having us.
started.
I
Thanks.
know.
Thank you.
Thank you to Ade.
Thank you so much, guys. So now we're going to move on to our next panel, which is about barriers to internal representation. No matter how much people advocate for change from outside, organizations need to be willing to change from within. And that requires representation in leadership. But the bamboo ceiling is a real issue. Cultural differences and subconscious bias can also make it harder to make the right connections or be in the right room at the right time. Here to help us navigate those barriers, we have Katie Sue, Senior VP and Head of Growth Marketing for HBO Max, Warner Media. We also have Marvin Chow, VP of Marketing at Google, and Indy Majumdar, Executive VP at Z Network.
Hey, everyone.
Hi, guys. Thanks for joining us. We're really excited to have you as part of this. So we'll kick it off with our first question. AAPI representation at leadership levels have historically been low. Another reader noted that when agencies recently released diversity numbers in response to the BLM movement, those of Asian descent had some of the lowest representation among POCs across the board. So what can we do to improve diversity and representation at the top? Marvin, can you take this one?
I mean, I think that, is it just for agencies or for everything? Sorry.
This is for everything, but somebody did note that agencies in particular have a problem.
I mean, one, thank you for having me on the panel. I think this is something where like a lot of things, it's two sides of the coin, I think, in a lot of ways, where at least in a lot of industries, we're seeing large populations of Asians in the workforce. But then as Nick Tran noted on the previous panel, like, where is it at leadership? There's a really popular Harvard Business study on the tech industry where Asians are the most sought after recruitment class, but the most least likely to get promoted. And so for us at Google, a lot of it is about data. Like, we love data. So we have our diversity report. We look at the talent pool. We look at, promotion rates across all the different areas, women, Asians, Black, Hispanic populations. And, we have to make sure that we're using data to make sure that our own biases are not getting in our way. Because ultimately, I think that to help the overall Asian population, you need to have the right amount of leadership, because that creates the culture shift, that creates the recruitment shift, and that creates a broader purview of what your community is supposed to look like within a company. And so that's kind of that first step, I think, in breaking that bamboo ceiling of what we can all do. And a lot of it comes down to the things we've heard, like, seeing leadership there, having mentorship, really focusing on what skills are necessary for, the new emerging populations of Asians in companies to be successful. And I'm a big believer in that last one as being a key to unlocking that.
Great. Outside of data or inclusive of data, Katie or Indy, do you have any thoughts on breaking those barriers?
Yeah, I can just chime in and add to what Marvin was saying. I think a lot of times, when people do get to places of leadership, as limited as it is, we have a great responsibility to take up space and show up and also extend the reach back to the communities and encourage openings and facilitate opportunities for, people of color and Asian Americans to just join those leadership ranks, but enabling them to do so with the proper mentorship, education opportunities, learning and development opportunities. I think that so often, it's such a small and limited pool that we just, sometimes put our head down and just keep going because we want to break the bamboo ceiling that way. But I think so much of it is about extending the community and making an active commitment to extending the community. And that includes like showing up and being active and giving back, but in ways that are tangible, like economics, investing in founders, investing in new talent, partnering with your HR and recruiting teams to source well. All of that is a part of the equation, I think, to be successful.
I think that's a really good point about taking up space, because I think a lot of us have sort of been trained from birth to like take up as little space as possible. It's hard to overcome.
And in line with what Katie just said, first of all, a warm hello to everyone, and thank you, Adage, for this great opportunity of having this panel. I would just chime in saying that, recruiting efforts should include outreach to Asian groups through events, career fairs, campus interviews, multicultural associations. I'm part of an organization called the Asian American Advertising Federation, wherein one can get associated with these to learn the cultural nuances. And a diverse pipeline in the organization is needed for varied views and understand the nuances and consumer behavior, so that you get in the right talent and you understand those communities and give them a fair opportunity. So this is pretty much what I would say in addition to what Marvin and Katie said.
So then let's move on to our next question. When is it the right time for Asian people in the industry to share that spotlight without feeling like we're taking something away from our brothers and sisters of color? I think this is a very timely one. Indy, could you start with this one?
Yes, certainly. I think it's a very interesting question on an interesting day when the first Black South Asian woman has taken charge as the Vice President of the White House. So I think there are two perspectives to this question. One is the human perspective, and then second is the business perspective. So in terms of the human perspective, I would say that we stood united with the African American community when the Black Lives Matter happened. We all know about that, and I firmly believe that all of us stand for education, empowerment, and equal opportunity for all. So until all of us in USA see respect and accept people of every color, every religion, and every sexual orientation, our work is not done. So I would say that we need to empower our multicultural communities and create awareness about the importance of Asian Americans. So this is from the human perspective. Now, since we are part of this community wherein it's a marketing and advertising forum, where I believe people from ad agencies, media, and then publishers, clients, agencies are part of that. One important thing is the business perspective. So we have currently 21 million Asian Americans in the US. And as Jay was saying in the last session, that the buying power of Asian Americans would go to 1.3 trillion by 2022. And out of that, since I'm part of a South Asian television network, and we see that 5.8 million South Asians are there, they're the fastest growing community with 81% growth in the last 10 years. So from the business perspective, if we are not giving due importance to this segment, I think somewhere we are not doing justice to what we are doing, because today the emphasis is also on substantiating or being accountable for what we do in our everyday lives, in our jobs. And all of us have a lot of accountability and stuff like that. I think that we should look at these angles when we are taking any key decisions as part of our broader strategies. So this is my take on that.
Yeah, I would love, yeah, I mean, you muted or?
Sorry, yeah, I just said, if either of you have a thought on that.
No, I mean, I agree 100% with Indy. I think, we talk about diversity.
Oh, Marvin, do you have any thoughts to add?
Am I muted? Sorry. I think, I agree with everything Indy talked about. And I think a lot of the way we talk about this is as a zero-sum game. I think that creating a company culture and a community of belonging is about all kind of genders and races and people. And I think that it's less about taking away from one group, but I think the more we can elevate as many voices as possible, all the communities kind of disproportionately will get impacted positively. And I get this question a lot as an Asian leader who, works a lot on the Black Lives Matter movement. I led a lot of the racial justice work at Google. And it's like, well, what about us? And I think that, each community needs something different to be successful as well. It's not like they're all fighting for the same resources or it's a battle. So I think it's really understanding each community. What are the challenges of each community and how do we help them? Because I think some of the advantages of the Asian community help another community and vice versa. And I think really thinking about each of the communities individually and what they need is going to be really, really important.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. Intersectional justice helps us all.
Yes. And so before we move on to the next question, we have more shout outs. We have Saloni from California, Ganesh from India, Marco from Mexico, Linda from New York, Catherine from Virginia, Abigail from North Carolina, Lisa from Maryland, and Betty from New York. And so, hey guys. Our next question is very timely. It's about Asian American female leadership. So I'll direct this one to you, Katie. How would you describe your working style? And if these characteristics don't fall in line with bias generally attached to Asian women, how have you managed to overcome them?
This is a really good question. I would describe my working style as what you see is what you get. I speak my mind, I show up, I'm very direct. And I think a lot of this is because of cultural heritage. You spend so much time, fighting against that sort of stigma of, taking direction and, being the person behind a brand and working really hard. I think over the years, I've definitely overcome that. And a lot of it is because of great mentorship and sponsorship. A lot of it is because of my community. I have a lot of friends who are Asian founders and Asian, entrepreneurs, and they've really, over the Crazy Rich Asians period, said to me, Katie, like, you need to show up and you need to take up space. You need to be vocal and you need to lift up the communities, because if you don't, then who? And I think, there's something to be said about not one person can do this, but I do think, like, look at all of us here. Each of us are in positions of influence and we can actually do really a lot of good for people who may not see people like us in leadership positions. And I think the only way to do that is to show up and be vocal. And so my leadership style is a lot of that. And I also create safe spaces. So my team has what we call an education council. We open it up to people who want to come in and speak about some of the challenges they're facing, real challenges in personal and in their career and professional paths. And we just actively try to find ways to push through them. And I think that comes with, again, going back to the same points earlier, active participation, active support, active sponsorship, and living and breathing that and leading by example so that other people can see that and feel comfortable and confident to do the same thing.
Yeah, so this a bias that may be attributed to Asian women, Asian American women. I mean, I think you could apply that even to Asian male leaders as well. So
I think Ian here is going to throw it to Marvin or Indy if you want to chime in on dealing with sort of being viewed in a way that doesn't comport with the general stereotype about you.
Yeah, I'm happy to go. I think, it's interesting. There's been a lot of great research. I think the National Academy of Science wrote an interesting paper about the bamboo ceiling, and it talked about how the bamboo ceiling is less about race than it is about culture fit. And I think these things are very intertwined, because it's like the culture is, in a lot of the companies that I've worked in, is an American culture. And so then you get into the model minority, and can you be more assertive, more American in your leadership style? And I think that in a lot of the companies, I'm not saying that race is not an issue, but this study really found that that it was less about race and more about assertiveness. And that comes back to almost like as a leader, there's so many dimensions to people. And I think we look at like introverts and extroverts. And I think you look at a lot of introverts, they have similar challenges to breaking through the panel because they're not that type of leader that the CEO or the CMO sees as someone that can get it done or motivate people or inspire people. And so a lot of the things that we talk about with everybody, regardless of where they're from, but their leadership style is you have to find your leadership style that works for you. Whatever your strength is, whatever your superpower is, you have to figure out how to turn that into a way to inspire people and motivate people and lead from the front. And that's been really important. And I think that's one of the areas that when we look at that bamboo ceiling of the Asian population, a lot of it comes down to how do you help get them, not change them, not have them conform, but how do they figure out how to accomplish the same output and bring the same value in their own way? And, I'm a loud person, but I like to say like I'm, 49% introverted. Like I had to really learn to figure out what my voice was in a room where I'm the only non-white person to make sure my point is heard and build the right allyship to make sure that I was supported those ways. And I think these are areas that whether you're a woman, whether you're Asian, whether you're an introvert, I think these are things that are really difficult to overcome, particularly in, I'll say, big American brand companies.
I think that's a very interesting point that, Marvin was making, and I could completely relate to that. I would like chime in with my experiences as a immigrant and being in the media and marketing space. So the funny thing is, I'll just give my own example. So I do a lot of travel for work. So a lot of times when I travel and come back and say I'm in an Uber and I'm talking to the driver, so he would say, let me take a guess. Are you a techie? Do you do coding at Google or IBM or anything? I said, no, I'm not a techie. Oh, you must be a doctor then. So you must be into healthcare and doctor, medical professional. I said, no, I'm not in that as well. Then they have a strange look on their face. So they say, like, what are you into then? I say, I'm into marketing. I'm into the business of television broadcasting. So the look that comes is that, and generally a lot of times during discussions, that how do you socialize? How do you connect? Like, do you have this bigger network? So I think this perception that is there, and it will take time, because that's a true fact. There's nothing wrong in that, because we are perceived as unsocial people, like people who have a language accent issue, and people who are not as strong, they're not as assertive or things like that. And there's a reason for that. Like while we were growing up in India or in different parts of Asia, so our parents wanted us to become doctors, engineers, study more, and do things like that. And if we see the data, 60% of all Asian immigrants are first generation immigrants, which means they have not studied here, they have not gone to school or college here, they don't have that social network, so they have to work extra hard in proving their worth, or maybe highlighting that fact to the companies, to corporations, or in the social circles, that they have substance, they have that intellect, they have that what do you say, that firepower in them. So that's a cultural thing. And to that question, I would say it'll take time, but we are slowly getting there. Like I think today people are much more accepting. People want to understand us. People want to know about us, be the Chinese or Indian community or the Filipino community. And there are cultural nuances. I think once we make an effort to know people of Asian origin, what are their cultural nuances and how they are like in their own thing, slowly these things would like improve. So that's a general perspective from my side, if I could make sense.
So we just have a couple of minutes left, but so far we've been talking about what we can do in order to make sure that we're sort of fitting at organizations. But I do want to end on this question, and Katie, maybe you can start us off. How can non-Asian peers help recognize and champion the voices of our Asian American counterparts? What are the subconscious biases, societal beliefs, and systemic barriers affecting Asian Americans?
So I'll start with the first one. I think there is a concept that we talk a lot about, we have a really great diversity consultant that works with us at Warner Media, and her name is Tracy Lawrence. She's incredible. And she talks a lot about the concept of sponsorship. And you heard me say it earlier, because I think mentorship is great when there is a person mentoring you who shares your experience, your background, sees the world through your eyes, and has lived the immigrant experience. I think sponsorship is more applicable because sponsorship is active participation, someone who is invested in your growth, someone who will actively push to have you in the room, someone who will sponsor your success and your career path. And I think the more companies can do that, the more likely it is for people with our backgrounds to be able to show up in rooms, because active sponsorship holds other people accountable as allies to show up as well, and doesn't just make it a responsibility of, you know, having a group of mentors. It's actual real accountability, and it drives for positive change. And I've seen it be very effective in the workplace.
All right. Unfortunately, we are out of time. I wish these were twice as long, but thank you so much, Katie, Marvin, and Indy, for
Yes.
talking with us.
Thank you.
Thanks, guys. We hope to carry on the
for
conversation.
having us, and real pleasure.
All right. So many marketers have little to no experience speaking to the AAPI community, and they may have no community members on staff to tap. So making an authentic connection becomes nearly impossible, and confusion about cultural nuances can lead to misunderstandings. So our next panel will talk about where can marketers reach the community and what role does multicultural marketing play. So for this panel, we have Isaiah Langawi, Partner and Chief Strategy Officer at Anomaly LA, Daphne Kwok, VP of Multicultural Leadership for Asian American and Pacific Islander Audience Strategy at the AARP, and Shilpa Gadak, Brand Marketing and Strategy Consultant. Hi, everyone.
Hey, everyone. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you.
All right, so first question. The AAPI community is lumped together but comprises such a broad group, including East Asians, South Asians, Southeast Asians, Pacific Islanders. What are the pros and cons of this, and how do the individual groups get proper acknowledgement and representation in advertising and marketing given such diversity? Isaiah, maybe we can start with you here.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, I think it's a tough thing to summarize what is 1 billion plus different experiences, and I think we have, you know, AAPI Heritage Month that we're able to kind of tap into in order to kind of represent the bigger parts and the shared parts of the experience. But I'd say that yeah, it can be you can find ways in which you can target kind of geographic communities that have been kind of created, national days that have been created, if you're looking to kind of tap into more specific elements and parts of the community. But I'd say that hasn't really been an approach I've seen so far. I think it tends to be one big minority mass that brands tend to kind of use. And I think we have an opportunity to offer some more nuance, because it does tend to shave away at some of the specifics of smaller subsets of the community, you know, particularly those that are smaller in number, like the Pacific Islander portion of the AAPI greater community. And so I think there's a lot more work to do, because even the representations of the greater mass have yet to really capture any more authenticity than just casting, in my opinion. But yeah, I think there's it's a hard brief, and I think it's been there's still more opportunity for us to kind of go in terms of representing the full spectrum of all the different voices in the community.
Shilpa or Daphne, do you have any thoughts about it's sort of come up in previous panels, like the 3 billion Asians in the world, and, you know, how many different languages and different cultures?
Yeah, I think that this is such an important question because there's a lot of layers to it, and I'm going to try to be brief, but I think there's a few points to make. I think that, you know, my personal belief is that broad sweeping generalizations across any group, right, be that the AAPI community, the BIPOC community, Latinos and Hispanics, even the Caucasian community, any community, it can pose challenges because yes, while we do share certain commonalities, everyone's individual experience within that identity group is really unique. And I think by nature, sometimes when we put, subsets and subsegments together, sometimes what can evolve are stereotypes that don't necessarily, represent all of the members of the community. And I know that in the world of marketing and advertising, it is one of our jobs, right, to like pull out those commonalities, pull out those similarities, to create those insights and uncover those human truths so that we can really create relevant content and represent a broader community. And so I do think that, yes, there are broad similarities just by nature of geography, by nature of our history of our Asian communities and cultures that we do share. But I think to Isaiah's point, right, there's nuances, and the power of creating truly representative messaging and content comes from those cultural nuances, and that's where it becomes a little difficult. And I think this is kind of the con of that. So like India, for example, like we were saying, is home to 1.3 billion people, right? There's 20 different states. Each even area of India has its own customs, its own culture, its own dance styles even, right? There's, over 8 different religions that people practice in India. There's over 22 different languages. So even just getting like a visual, accurate representation of what the Indian experience is like is even difficult. And so I think one of the biggest cons of creating structuralized segments, in my view, is that it's very short. It's a short-lived and short-term, I think, way of thinking about the integration of racial ethnicity, especially in the U.S. And I know that may sound like a provocative statement, but the reason why I say that is because I think the beautiful complexity of what it means to be Asian and Asian American is ever evolving and ever changing. Even if you look at first generation, second generation, third generation, you look at mixed race Asian communities. We have an amazing, wonderful women vice president who's part of the Asian community, but also part of the African Caribbean community, et cetera. And so I think that experience of what it looks like to be represented as part of the Asian community is different for every person. So, last point I'll make is I think that while it's important to recognize those nuances, I think in order to get ahead of the curve, we as a community and frankly, we as a nation sometimes, like, we need to move away from looking at us as separate ethnicity groups, but really just members of the overall human race and really what we bring to the table, because I think that's where true representation really happens.
Great. And maybe
everyone.
to add too is that I think for the pros, I think maybe the only pro is that at least we're at the table. Oftentimes the AAPI community is not even at the table. And so if it means lumping us all together in order to be at the table, at least we're being discussed, at least we're at the table. But really the cons of the lumping together is much greater, because as we know, the diversity is so complex, and we should really get companies, organizations, make them answer the hard questions, and really have them think about the diversity and the different communities and where they're willing to really invest in, get to learn more. And in your first panel, Jay Kim talked about AAPI intensive 101 trainings. I think that education is so key and critical to inform internally organizations, and really going through each of those different ethnic groups to bring out the differences. And I think so much more of that fundamental, foundational education of our communities is needed.
So Anne Christine is having a little bit of technical difficulty, so I am going to bring on Mike Zhang, who is our ad tech reporter and
Thank you very much
moderator.
for having me, and we'd like to obviously continue the conversation. So one other interesting question that we found: do you think that the cultural diversity of the group is what has prevented brands from truly reaching and understanding this community? Daphne, would you like to take this one?
Yes, I think very much so. I think that companies really have to tackle the hard issues when it comes to AAPIs, really being able to understand. Companies can't be lazy when it comes to the AAPI community, right? In order to be truly relevant, to really be able to understand each of the ethnic groups. It takes time and it takes commitment. And that means commitment from the top down, right? Really from the CEO's office and board level, senior leadership all the way down to really be able to make that kind of commitment. Let's take the supermarket industry as one, right? Grocery stores, the mainstream supermarkets, last 10, 20, 30 years haven't necessarily been reaching out to our different diverse communities. So up comes the different Asian, very specific ethnic supermarkets, which are serving our communities much more specifically, and how they're booming. And then the mainstream supermarkets now, a little bit late in the game, trying to increase their ethnic aisles. But the ethnic supermarkets is a way also to reach out to our Asian American community. And especially at AARP in 2020 with the November elections, we were able to partner with Ranch 99 to be able to do voter engagement very specifically into the AAPI community. And so I think that might be a good example of how it can be used.
I think that's a great point, Daphne, that you make about corporate laziness. Like we see that so many brands and organizations weren't making change on Black Lives Matter until absolutely forced to, and it would be a tragedy if it took more killings to move the conversation forward for every other group. Isaiah or Shilpa, do you have any thoughts about this?
Yeah, I mean, I definitely agree with Daphne's point in a lot of ways. But I mean, honestly, I think it's just a little bit of what you were saying. It's the laziness, right? If people truly were interested in representing the Asian community, you do the work, right? As a brand leader, like you get in and understand what are the nuances of the different parts of the Asian community, what part of your target group and consumer segment, what do you need to understand about their lives? What do you need to understand about their values? What do you need to understand about the way that they, their beliefs and the way that they choose even their decisions in consumerism? And so I think while I would love to say that the diversity of the group is maybe a barrier, it could be, but I think honestly, it's just probably not, it hasn't been a priority for brands, and it should be.
Yeah, I'd say just to kind of, to add to that is, the way that we kind of move beyond kind of the performative aspect of how companies can kind of relate better to these communities is through better representation within the companies themselves. I think there's an opportunity where we can go beyond the idea of the model minority. And what I mean by that is at least having leaders who are, having AAPI leaders who are willing to be more assertive around how we put the needs and the views of this community on the corporate agenda at different companies, and how we can kind of push for that, rather than what can often happen where it doesn't need addressing, or it doesn't need to be considered as an important kind of community or important message to kind of reach, because it can kind of fall in under the general market. I think for us, a big part of the identity conversations that are happening is we're seeing all different kinds of communities, come into their own and assert themselves not only in the boardroom but also in terms of their demands, in all different aspects of life. And so I think it's a very encouraging move, as we're seeing, even just today, the breadth of representation from the community, in all the rooms that matter in corporate America. And so I think it'll be a trend that will continue, but I think it will be driven hopefully by having more members of the community in important decision-making roles, and more allies who are aligned to the importance of authenticity in some of the decisions being made.
It's a great segue into our next question. And Isaiah, you're the agency guy, so this one's probably a good place for you to start with. What are the best ways for general market agencies and Asian American agencies to collaborate on educating and convincing the corporate world about supporting the Asian community?
Well, I think it's a great question, because I think I think it's important for, I guess at least my opinion is on general market versus specialist agencies is it's incumbent on general market agencies to not be so general about reaching these different audiences. And I think it's really important for general, for agencies that are considered general market to be more specific, not only in their representation internally in terms of their staff, but also, how they could be helping to kind of shape some of these conversations and not leaving it just to specialists. That said, the role that specialists can play in helping general market agencies to kind of to continue to kind of be at their best is important. And so I'd say, the data is there, the stories are there. How we make sure that both those things blend into not just the business case, but the cultural imperative for bringing some of these experiences into our creative development are really important. But I think that it is 1 + 1 = 3 when it comes to general market agencies that need to make this a specialty within themselves, but also how we can kind of better collaborate with those agencies that have been in the field, that have been doing this, and whose muscle in this area should be tapped into and built upon.
Are there any other thoughts that you would like to add, Daphne or Shilpa? So let's keeping the conversation moving a little bit. Some shout outs that we would like to cover. Hello to Javier from Chile, Kristen from California, or Kirsten from California, Christian from New Jersey, hello there, Hope from Illinois, Babak from Iran, Joycelyn from Canada, John from New York, and Susan from California. Hello to everybody joining us in this conversation. So moving the conversation along, how can affinity groups for the folks that identify as Asian or AAPI better serve those employees and the agency? What are some of the best practices that we can bring forward in this situation? Shilpa, would you like to take this one? I believe you're muted. If you could kind of pop the button there.
I'm sorry about that. Yeah, for sure. I mean, I think it's a mixture of education and advocacy, especially within the affinity group areas. For example, when I was part of P&G, one of the biggest affinity groups was with the Asian community, and what I really gathered from that was having a coach and having an advocate sort of be there to help me not only guide my career, but also help advocate for me within the community at my organization. I think that there are nuances that sometimes being a part of an Asian heritage that we are reared with, right? The way that we look at leadership and authority, the way that we ourselves, express ourselves as leaders. While again, this is a generalization, but typically for a lot of Asian families, we look at authority figures and we usually do not argue against it, right? Like we're told if something is kind of told to us to do, we do it. And I think what I learned just being a part of the Western culture was that you can, sometimes push back on authority. If you don't agree with it, speak up, use your voice. And these are just not natural things that sometimes come to members of the Asian community. And I think by helping bridge that gap with affinity groups and being able to have a coach and have a mentor or support person to help you understand that these are actual things that will benefit you in your career, I think that that's super helpful. Similar to leadership styles, right? Not everybody is outspoken, not everybody is very, very vocal, but that doesn't mean that you're not effective as a leader. That doesn't mean that you're not effective in motivating your team. And so I think there's an education component that really needs to be set forth, that there's not one way to look at leadership and what an effective leader is. And so that's where I think our affinity groups can help.
I'll just say maybe also that I think the affinity groups or ERGs are actually really underutilized, and especially AAPI employees who are interested in really serving their community. I've been able to tap into them, like for my South Asian strategy. I have a a little advisory group that I convene to have them as my sounding board. They are the focus group. I utilize our AAPI employees to do our ethnic media, especially those that have the language skills to be able to help us be the spokespeople. And for them, it's extremely fulfilling. First of all, it's professional development on their side, public speaking, as we continue to improve our public speaking skills. Media skills is very important. But then also for them, they're also getting the fulfillment too. I have one Asian American employee at AARP who had been an employee for like 15 years and had never been asked to utilize her Chinese language skills. And I had her out in the community to do an activation event, and she was just so thrilled beyond belief. But also for them, they feel much more tied into the organization, feel much more at stake, but also can be a tremendous ambassador for the organization back into their families, their friends, and their community. So I would highly say that we should definitely tap into our Asian American internal employees.
We've only got about a minute left, but this next question is kind of close to my heart. What has been your experience as someone with a unique name? Do you think adding a pronunciation guide on a resume will help or hurt an applicant? I think this is a good point, right? Like even if you have maybe like a Western first name, often people have an identifiably Asian last name, and as we know, and certainly bias comes into play in the hiring process. Anyone want to take it?
From my perspective, it can really hurt at the beginning of your career. I mean, I have pronunciation guides. It is a big part of how I introduce myself in any new room. I think over time, I was able to kind of build the confidence to own it rather than run away from it and apologize for it. And I think bringing that experience into a leadership role means that I'm very conscious of it. With next generations of people with the same situation. I think you have to own it. It's your name. It's the thing that makes you unique. And I don't think people should be afraid to kind of put pronunciation guides for the sake of appeasing people. And I think if that's already a worry about the corporate culture that you're applying to, then that's all you need to know.
Yeah.
That's a great point.
That's actually a really good point bringing up. It's something that everybody's been facing when you submit the resume and you don't know how they're going to view your first name or your last name. Daphne, Shilpa, would you like to add any comments to that?
Totally agree with Isaiah.
Exactly. Yep. 100% on board.
Thank you very much. So obviously a lot of issues to discuss. Thank you, Isaiah, Daphne, and Shilpa for joining us on this program. Stay with us. We're going to discuss inclusive marketing next. Ishan?
Yeah. Thank you.
Thanks all. So if you are just joining us, I am Ishan Sherwood, Associate Creativity Editor here at Ad Age, here with my co-moderator, Mike Zhuang, Ad Tech Reporter at Ad Age. Thanks for being here. And now for our final panel.
We're looking at inclusive marketing. We've come a long way from stereotypes about kung fu fighting, dragon ladies, but offensive tropes still make it into global campaigns. Only recently have we begun to see these convincing depictions of Asians and their families in Western media. Here to talk about how brands and agencies can improve, we have Michelle Grant, Senior Art Director, GSD&M, Telly Wong, Senior VP and Chief Content Officer at the IW Group, and Tatiana Tran, copywriter at Wyden & Kennedy. Thank you all for joining us today. So first question I want to bring up here, what's your take on the state of Asian American representation in advertising today? Over the years, we've seen increasing diversity in ads when it comes to people of color, LGBTQ, and is this enough? What do we need to see more of? And in your own experiences, what sorts of attitudes around diversity have you seen when it comes to casting in ads and AAPI talent? This is probably a question that, Michelle, would you like to take it?
Yes, hi. Thank you for organizing this, and thank you for all the viewers who are staying with us. So I want to acknowledge that there has been an increase in diversity. Brands are recognizing the importance of reflecting our world, and they're seeing the value. And it definitely doesn't hurt that younger generations are expecting it and demanding it. You know, representation for BIPOC and LGBTQ has grown, but I believe more work should be done and can be done. And when it comes to Asian American representation, I want to see more narratives, more stories, and more nuance. And casting is one tool for representation, but I see it as the last chance for diversity before you're about to produce an ad, because the ideal situation is to concept with diversity in mind and base that work around insights or from the experiences of those who are in the room concepting. But I have also experienced times when, you know, casting specs sort of shift along the way. And part of that is due to this, I guess, this point of view of viewing AAPI representation as being proportionate to the US population. And so since Asian Americans are a smaller portion of the population, I've seen, what I have experienced is that there is almost this like deprioritization that happens where there's more focus on other populations. And I'd really like to challenge this thinking. Beforehand, when I was in the room, I didn't feel as comfortable speaking on that or calling it out or questioning it. But today I'm definitely feel more empowered to do that. And I'd really like to challenge this thinking because, one, I want to question the research behind it. Like, what's the data that supports that? For the longest time, there has been one point of view that has like really dominated our world. And so I wonder if there's like implicit bias that was in that research. But two, I think it should be a market opportunity. I mean, we're essentially in the business to increase market shares. And so I don't know why some brands, some companies sort of move away from that type of representation. And so those are things that I would really like to see.
Does, in previous panels, it's sort of come up that, you know, often these changes don't happen unless they're being forced. I don't know, are we going to need some sort of Asian Pepsi moment before, you know, brands realize they might be losing money here? Anyone feel free.
What's the tipping point, so to speak? We've all seen the infamous Pepsi ads, the Kendall Jenner ones. What's sort of the moment where the conversation finally shifts in the right direction?
I can jump in on that. It's not just having diversity, but having that inclusion. You know, it was touched upon earlier in the talk about internal representation, and part of it is having people in the room that will that can bring new perspectives, and then also call things out when there is something that is stereotypical, that is, you know, coming to life, and just having the people in the room. And then this work gets created where I used to view representation as a more personal thing, where I wanted to see myself reflected in the world, in the media that I was consuming, and then also for others to experience that. But another element of representation that is so important is that it helps shape other people's perspectives of other groups. And in that sense, it creates a more like empathetic world. And so that, I think what needs to happen is that once there are more people in, they're also creating work and putting work out into the world. And so people will feel more empowered to I don't know, have more conversations and hold the space to create more representation.
Okay, so our next question: how do we create more inclusive marketing? That was pretty open-ended. Maybe Titania, you can start.
Yeah, I think for me, it sounds like now we're seeing a demand for more stories, and we interpret that as inclusive marketing. But I think that it's worth thinking more about who is actually telling those stories. And I think if we spend time thinking about who is telling the stories, we can solve for some of the things that are problematic in what is positioned as an inclusive story, but can be damaging when you look at how people are actually represented in them. And so a story, if I could share, a Vietnamese folktale that I've recently learned of, and I'm still learning because there are so many tellings of it. I think it is a good example of why it's important to consider who's telling the story. It's the story of Batju, which roughly translates to Lady Ju. She was this woman who lived in the 3rd century in Vietnam during a time when it was occupied by the Chinese. They had invaded the land and exploited it for both its resources and its labor. And so Batju, who was living there, experienced and saw the suffering that it caused her and her family and the people there. And so she led an uprising, a rebel army against the Chinese officials there. And the way that they describe her in these folktales is very impressive. They say that she was this huge woman who was 9 feet tall, that she had a booming voice that you could hear for miles and it was clear as a bell, and that she had breasts that were 3 feet long, and she would sling them over her shoulders as she rode into battle on the back of a white elephant. And when I first heard that story, I thought it was so impressive, and I was so compelled by it. But it was only later that I learned of another telling that helped me to understand how damaging that telling of the story was. According to Vietnamese sources, the true story is that she was an orphan who grew up with her brother. And at the time, the age when she would have married, she decided that it was more important for her to fight back. There was more important things for her to do than to be a housewife. And so at 19, she started training secretly in the forest, and she started recruiting people to train with her. And after training for a while and preparing, they say that her brother led this rebel army to fight against the Chinese. But because of how fiercely everyone saw her fighting, they unanimously decided that she should be the one to lead that rebel army. And so she did that for, I think, close to 2 years and over 30 battles. And she became such a threat that the Chinese officials at the time knew that they had to stop her. And so they did, but only after over a year and after sending 9,000 troops her way, over 9 times the resources that she had. But before I guess when she was at the end, she decided that she would rather die than to submit to her enemies. So she jumped off a cliff. But even then, they realized that she was still too powerful because her story was powerful. Because if people knew, if they remembered what she did and who she was, they could continue to activate and mobilize around her story and come back against the Chinese. And so that's why they embellished the story. They changed it to be the version that I first heard. Her as this fantastical being that people could idolize, but they couldn't relate to anymore.
So the retelling then becomes only the mighty can affect change, and since you are not mighty, you shouldn't bother trying.
Yeah, it's curious in that the story itself is flattering, but when you think about what is the most empowering, it's not how great someone sounds, it's how much you see yourself in them, how much you relate to them. And so I think when we're thinking, circling back to the question of how do we create we should have the people who lived their experiences tell those stories, because they're going to tell it in a way that serves the people who lived them and the people after who inherit both the trauma and the glory and the pride of those stories. There's power in knowing what people like you are capable of.
Tatiana, those are two very interesting contrasts that highlight the importance of portrayal in stories and about the overall experience that the AAPI community is facing. So moving on to that next question then, are there brands that currently are doing a good job of giving voice to the Asian and AAPI experience? Telly, would you like to take this question?
Yeah, thanks. I think McDonald's, which is in full disclosure a client of IW Group, we've been working with them for nearly 20 years now as their agency of record for marketing to Asian Americans. And they've been very consistent when it comes to expanding the horizons and the boundaries of what is Asian American marketing. And you've seen this pivot from sort of more traditional, sort of family-centric advertising and creative towards stuff that more accurately reflects where Asian American youth culture and Asian youth culture in general is right now. So in the last couple of years, the brand has done everything from b-boy competitions to commercials featuring the Kinjas and influencers and K-pop stars, and also doing a lot more in the K-pop space as well. And I think that comes from really agencies and brands having conversations and really educating one another about a brand's priorities and the opportunities within a community to really take an insight or take some kind of subculture and hit the bullseye with it when it comes to the Asian American community, but also identify something that could also transcend it and speak to a larger audience.
All right, so next question then. This is from Renee from Chelsea, Massachusetts, my old haunts. She asks, do you feel as though Asians get stereotyped and grouped as one voice when portrayed in advertising or media? How do you address that? Is it even noted or considered when you are the focus of any type of reach objective? Michelle, can you take that?
Yeah. I'm going to say, it's been mentioned already before, but the model minority myth, I feel like a lot of prevailing stereotypes of Asian Americans stem from this singular narrative. Stereotypes, they reduce and they simplify, and they're very limiting. And this might be more of a general market observation, but if you turn on the TV today, you'll still see some of these stereotypes of the submissive tech nerd. And, that's just one example. But I think one way of avoiding these stereotypes is by having people in the room who can call them out. But another way is to get specific. And the term Asian American Pacific Islanders covers a lot of backgrounds, and it's hard to check off a bunch of boxes. And the more you try to include in your message, the more it is likely to be diluted. And so I think the key here is to get specific so that you can reveal a universal truth or a human truth that resonates. Because the power of inclusive messaging is that while you are speaking to one specific group or groups, it's also not exclusive or dismissive, so that there's still something relatable for other people who are viewing it. And in that case, everyone benefits.
Yeah, and I just want to add, I think speaking from a little bit more of a historical perspective as a Gen Xer, I think the community has made some amazing strides in the past 3 decades. When you look at, where we were in the 80s, where the only game in town was, Mr. Miyagi and Long Duck Dong. And now we've got all these different shows and programming and films and music featuring Asian Americans. And really, we're diversifying our representation on a multitude of platforms. So I think we're heading in the right direction, but I agree with everyone that there's still more work to do. But I'm really happy and pleasantly amazed to see the progress that we've made in the, really in the past 5 to 10 years. The doors have really been kicked open.
Thank you for that. Marion from Brooklyn, for our next question, is asking us, do you have a favorite example, a recent example, of really well-conceived marketing to Asian and AAPI consumers? Tatiana, would you like to take this one?
I think a good example is one that we talked about recently in this group, the Disney spot that featured a Filipino family. And I watched it again last night, and I think what was so, and I think this touches on what Michelle was saying earlier, that a good representative stories start with the actual conception of them and not just when you get to casting. And with that story, it was so clear to see that it was the heartbeat of that story. And there were so many nuances that were worked into the story that you might not notice, but it's things that you recognize if you are part of that community. And I think that's for me, the stories that I feel most compelled to is when I see things that I'm like, oh man, those are things that I did, or those are things that my family did.
Yeah, I believe this was featured on the Creativity Top 5 a few weeks ago. Ads like this always remind me that in the 80s, McDonald's had campaigns geared toward Black Americans, but those actually performed better among general market and white Americans than the general market work that was being made, right? Like speaking to wider audiences actually reaches everyone more. And speaking of some channels or platforms, let's go on to the next question. Tally, maybe you can take this one. So generally speaking, which channels or platforms have yielded the most successful results for you? Digital or print ads, videos, emails, grassroots, community outreach, etc.
Definitely digital and social platforms and working with influencers. I think that's really, if you're doing any sort of marketing to the Asian American segment or community, it's got to be digital and social first, because that's where we live. And I think with these new platforms that are propping up, I think for me, that's really amazing to see with what SiriusXM and 88 Rising are doing, launching the first 24/7 Asian American music channel. And then on a smaller scale, just this proliferation of podcasts now with different voices from across the political and social spectrum, like Bobby Lee and his Tiger Belly podcast. So I think we're seeing much more conversation and sort of the intermingling of ideas now happening within the community. And I think that debate is going to be very helpful and useful moving forward.
Titania or Michelle, any thoughts on that?
Sorry, I just realized that I was muted. I was just,
No worries.
I was just gonna say I agree with that, and the importance of like realizing where you can most engage with the audience.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you to Michelle, Telly, and to Tanya, with apologies, for joining us today. Ishan?
Thanks so much, everyone. I would now like to bring back on Christine Diaz, creativity editor.
Am I back or am I frozen?
We hear you. I hear you.
Oh, good.
But,
okay.
All right, so that is all the time that we have for today. And while we couldn't get to all of your questions, Ad Age will be continuing this series addressing diversity and inclusion in the ad world. So keep an eye out at adage.com/events for updates on our next town hall. And thank you to all of the panelists who took the time today to thoughtfully and passionately answer all of these questions.
Yeah, I'm so grateful to the panelists for sharing their experiences and so many examples. I think we learned a lot. We learned that data is important. If specificity leads to globality, I think, or a specific message can be global. Also, more stories like Disney and McDonald's, and no more long duck dongs. So those are just a few notes, but you guys can all go back and watch this video again to take it all in if you missed.
If you missed it. So we do want to give a few thank yous to our Ad Age crew: Alfred Mascaroni, Anna Sakula, Max, Sternlicht, and Elise Liefering for making this live stream happen. So everyone, thanks so much for joining us, and enjoy the rest of your day.